As a leader, your primary responsibility for the people that you're leading is to really look out for what's best for them. And
Yep.
sometimes that means
Yep.
they're on your team. Sometimes it means they're not. But I think you're getting more goodwill in the workplace than going the other way around,
Kick it.
Welcome to Strata Stories. My name is Thomas Schreiber. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Strata PT. Strata PT combines your EMR and billing into one automated system to increase revenue and achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate for physical, occupational, and speech therapy clinics. Recently, Strata PT was ranked the #1 EMR and billing system in outpatient therapy and rehab from Class Research. On today's episode, Paul Singh, the CEO of Strata PT, talks with Rafi Salazar, a PT and the CEO of Proactive Rehab and Wellness. In this episode, Paul and Rafi cover effective leadership, including hiring, letting go, and team management, what conversations need to occur to ensure employee retention, and lastly, how to ensure a smooth EMR billing transition through team collaboration. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and billing works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo. Now, without further delay, here's today's episode.
About a week ago, you put a post online on LinkedIn is where I saw it. I can't read the whole thing. I mean, it's a kind of long one, but it had to do with like employee retention. And I remember reading this and I was like, oh boy, this is going to be like a controversial one. But you didn't get flamed in the comments.
No. I mean, I got a couple comments on Facebook that were like, oh, this is such a good perspective. And then one that was like, you don't care about your people, but
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about this because, employee retention in the clinical space is tough. I mean, it's like a hot topic. It's almost like taboo to talk about unless it's behind closed doors. But in the post, you kind of like explained your thoughts on how you think about employee retention. I don't want to steal your thunder here, but let's just talk about it. So why don't you start by explaining what you were saying in the post, if you recall? And then I'm curious, like you gave a couple tactics here. It seemed like there were a couple tactics on how to handle it, but I'm curious, like if there's more to this.
Yeah. So, I mean, over the last couple months, probably 3 or 4 months, well, maybe more than that. Shoot, I feel like it's been going on for a while. Last 6 or 7 months, we've had three teammates in particular at the clinic depart ways, and not like in a bad way that was, there was bad blood or it was a performance issue. It was like their life was taking them in a different direction and they determined that it was, they weren't going to be part of the team anymore, which is always a difficult conversation to have. I think a lot of times as a leader, sometimes we get this idea in our minds that a team member leaves and it's something I did wrong. Like, what did I fail to do? Was I a bad boss? Did I, not pay them enough? Did I not provide them with enough opportunity? What was it? And I think that's one of the things that happens. But I've always tried very, very heavily to have like this very open relationship with my team members, where it is more of, employment in my mind is not so much you're doing a job for me and this team, and that's great. Like you're contributing to the organization, but every opportunity to join a team or to work together is really two discerning professionals deciding whether or not there's a fit between the priorities and the goals of each and the skills that they each bring to the table, and whether it makes sense to continue a working relationship. And sometimes that doesn't change for years or decades, right? And sometimes it changes rather quickly. And a lot of the ones recently we've had at the team, it's like, listen, the conversation I just had a couple of weeks with a therapist was like, listen, my wife and I are considering having starting a family. You have a health share here. The hospital will let me come on full time for 6 months, get full benefits, and then I can come back PRN after that and retain my full benefits. And I was, I told him, I was like, listen, I would be a bad boss if I told you to stay and work with me, because it's clearly, this is one of those opportunities that is just going to be better for you and your family in the long run. So
Yeah.
I do feel like as a leader, your primary responsibility for the people that you're leading is to really look out for what's best for them. And sometimes that means they're on your team. Sometimes it means they're not. But I think you're getting more goodwill in the workplace than going the other way around,
Well, in a similar vein too, I think this kind of topic is so difficult to talk about because, like I said, it's taboo. Nobody really wants to talk about it. But the other reason it's kind of difficult too is because, people forget there are better ways to handle this too. Like we had an employee that we had to part ways with. I'm mixing up dates now, but let's just call it within the last 3 months or so. And the conversation ultimately boiled down to like, hey, look, this isn't working, but like we're all feeling the same way, and let's handle this with kindness. And
Yeah.
hey, because we don't have any like strict policies around like termination notices and all that stuff. But I was just kind of like, look, why don't we just pay for another month of salary if that'll help like soften the blow? But the point is, like, you can have these conversations with kindness as well, especially if it's not going well. Like your example is like, I think, one of those scenarios where, the employee's already decided that they're going to part ways. And the examples you gave of your previous managers was that they were looking out for you. And now you're carrying that up forward with your businesses as well, right? Like where you're treating these people with respect. I guess what I'm trying to say in a poorly articulated way is that the same can be said about when you have to part ways because maybe the role isn't working out or the person isn't working out or whatever. It's an interesting, to me, I find these topics interesting because, like, again, nobody really talks about this stuff. Like everything that's like all the business advice online is like,
managing your
I don't know.
performa and your metrics and financials,
Yeah.
but what happens when
Yeah.
Bob isn't being productive,
Right. Yeah. Right, exactly. It's like, because it's like, it's all like the hard skills. Hey, here's how you make that P&L, or here's how you do whatever. But nobody wants to talk about what it's like when you're standing there looking somebody in the eye. And I don't know how, I won't put you on the spot, but I know for me, like, I feel an obligation to not only them, but their families as well, but then also to the rest of the team, And so it's this balance of like, okay, how do we handle this with kindness, but with respect to all the people that are affected by this?
You want to be human in the way you do it, but the reality is like A performers don't want to work with C performers. So you're doing the team a disservice by keeping them on. I've always taken the position that a team member should never be surprised if you have a conversation that results in you terminating them, right? I think a lot of like the angst and stuff that people feel about it is like, well, we just haven't had clear expectations the entire relationship. And now it's finally devolved to the point where we've got to fire you, like,
Yeah.
maybe it's my past role in the federal government where they were big on like performance improvement plans and check-ins and all that. But like, I'm always talking with my clinicians about it. We're having this conversation. And if anybody does dip down into a place where they're not having, whatever, they're not meeting whatever benchmark or standard, like we're having a conversation. Like, this is the
Right.
plan. I expect
Right.
it to improve, over the next 3 months. If not, we're going to be having another conversation.
I'm curious, like, have there been other, I don't know how to ask this question, but, I remember for me, going through my own sort of like professional development, I don't know when it dawned on me that in the role that you and I are in, leading our respective companies, we can kind of change the rules. Meaning, like, nobody ever really said, "Hey, the severance for an employee has to be 2 weeks, or it has to be 3 weeks, or it has to be whatever it is." I don't know when it dawned on me that, like, we could just do whatever we felt was right.
Yeah.
And even if it meant like, "Hey, listen, this isn't working out. Today is your last day, but we will pay you for another month." Like, I don't know, like, I don't know when that just randomly appeared in my head where I'm like, "Oh, wait, I can make it, I can do that." Cause I remember a long time ago, I just felt awkward about it. It's like, "Hey, listen, this isn't working out. And, how about next Friday's your last day?" And that's where payroll. And I just thought that's what I was supposed to do. And then I think one day I was just like, "Oh, I guess I can just make the rules." um, are there like tactics or things like that where you've, picked up over the years as you're dealing with like, retention or retaining or parting ways with employees?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A big one, you kind of nailed it on the head at the beginning there. Like, I think like if you've made the decision to terminate somebody, it does not do any good to keep them around for 2 or 3 weeks, because that at that point, like, they're basically doing nothing because they know their job is over. And then there's always a chance that like just like negative conversations happen and it sows resentment and all that kind of stuff. So I'm a big fan of like the times that I've had to terminate somebody because it wasn't working out. It was like we had a conversation at 8 in the morning. They were gone by 8:30. Like,
Yeah.
Sure, we paid them. There was some severance involved, but it was like,
Yeah.
it just doesn't, it's not going to do you any good. It's not going to do me any good. It's going to like drag the whole team down for the next 3 weeks. Like, why don't you just go start applying for jobs, start doing what you need to do. You'll still have money for a couple weeks, whatever. I think that's one of the big ones.
I would imagine it's even more important at the clinic level, especially if it's a clinician anyways, where they're seeing patients, it's
exactly.
That thing you talked about there, you mentioned sort of that I think is kind of uncomfortable, but real, is those negative conversations could be with other employees. It could also be with patients, and that neither of those things is good. it's definitely interesting. Um, maybe just kind of like switching gears here a little bit. Unless you think of anything else you want to talk about there. Full disclosure for anybody listening, you recently transitioned into our platform at Strata. And I was telling you in the
Yeah, you
pre-show, like
finally
I
got me.
genuinely don't want this to turn into like an advertisement or anything like that. I'm curious, like if Rafi from today could go back to Rafi from, let's call it 3 months ago or whenever, when you, before you even like kind of even thought about migrating to us or anything like that, were things harder than you thought, easier than you thought? And again, this is not necessarily a thing about Strata. I mean, you can make it about that, but really more about like,
Just a big transition.
yeah, like you're making a transition. You got to deal with like your team probably saying, oh gosh, now I got to learn something new, or you know, the
Yeah.
risk of like interruption of pay of cash flows. Like just, can you just talk a little bit about that? Was there, the answer might just be no, it's fine, but
I think it was a good transition, a smooth transition. I think part of that was we had learned a lot from transitioning. So we were with Raintree when I bought the business back in 2020, and like immediately knew that it was not going to be a long-term solution because of the way that it worked. It was like it was PC only. It was like local. You had to download a piece of software, and it was just a big mess. And then it was like old school, like in order to save things, you were like hitting F10 and like up caret this to like make things work. I was like, how are people still using this? So we made the switch very early. Like I think I bought the practice. We closed October of 2020. By February of 2021, we were transitioning to a new
mm,
EMR, and we went with WebPT because at the time
yep.
they were just like, if you know, most clinicians coming out of school had done a rotation where WebPT was there, so onboarding would have been easy, right? So we did that transition, and that one was probably a cluster from the beginning, and it was mostly because of like my lack of understanding of like being a business owner, like a clinic owner, and kind of managing that process and who needs to be involved and all that kind of stuff. The team didn't really get much of an input. It was like I chose WebPT, we were going to go with WebPT, right? And then it disrupted cash flow for a variety of reasons. One of which was that we were like switching billing companies at the same time. And part of me was like, we had already been losing, like when we bought the business, I think I mentioned this, you know, when we first had a conversation years ago, like it was losing 50K a quarter when we bought it because it was the tail end of COVID, it was whatever. So we were
Yep.
like coming out of pocket for a lot of stuff anyways. And in my mind, I was like, well, I'll just muscle through for another couple months to get a good system in place. You know, like why try to fix, like right the sinking ship first? So we just did it. It was like we ripped a band-aid off, we did a big change. And there were a lot of things that were like on my mental checklist. Like I mentioned this before, this document that's like every how to for all the business operations in general, like how do you put a patient into the EMR, how do we call patients, all of that kind of stuff. And I had made a document, like a little sheet on that doc that was like all the things that needed to be, that I didn't take account for, that ended up biting us in the butt around this change for the EMR. So by the time we went into the decision that it was time to leave WebPT for various reasons, I'm not going to disparage anybody or talk poorly. It was just time for us to have, you know, go in separate directions. There were already a bunch of things on my list. Like, okay, these are the things that we need to make sure of are in place before, during, and after the transition to make sure things like patient retention wasn't an issue, that patients were actually getting like things you might not remember, like think about like the way you process reminders and notifications for appointments, all that kind of stuff, all the way down to like these are the steps for cash flow and making sure EDI is set up and all of that. And basically what we did was we had this list. And I guess before, like backing up, before we even made the decision which platform we were going to go with, we evaluated like 3 or 4. And the process was pretty simple. I would have a call with some sales rep for that company, and my standing policy is like, well, I don't make decisions on the first call. I'm definitely going to bring it to the team because I'm not in the EMR all that much. You know, like I
Yeah.
treated one patient last week. I did one note in Strata, which was nice, but I just don't use it all that much, right? I'm looking at the reporting and stuff. So did an initial call, set up just during like our staff meeting time, like a demo with the whole team. And it was basically like a debrief, you know, like we would do a demo, the team would give me their input, what they liked, what they didn't like. And then at the end of that, so this is like probably a 6-week cycle of different, you know, different calls, different demos. We had another like all hands meeting, and I basically just laid out the reason for the decision. Like these are the things in which, for like, you know, this EMR is falling short, or the reason we're considering changing. These are the benefits we're hoping to get, which is why we looked at these different platforms. which one, would you feel comfortable with this one, that one, A, B, or C. We kind of tallied it up, and ultimately, like the buck stops with me. It's my decision. But I've found anyways, or maybe this is just my perception, like involving the team early on, having the discussion about like the reason behind changing, because change is always hard, but like couching that change in the context of like, okay, these are our goals as an organization. This
Right.
is really what we're trying to do. And this is how we can't, given our current, platform or limitations or whatever, really got them on board with, okay, this is a decision, like it's going to happen. This is why we're doing it. And then giving them feedback throughout the process for, these are the options. What don't we like? What do we like? We had a conversation about like, what's the biggest fear you have about transitioning to,
Yep.
whatever.
Yep.
And we had the team put them down, and we were like, okay, so we're going to try to address this. We're going to try to address this, and probably had 3 or 4 different calls with each vendor before we decided to pick one. And Corey on your team was great and answered all of our questions. And I'd always be like, oh, one more thing. This one just came up. But I felt like it was very important for the team here to feel like their input was taken into consideration in the
Right.
choice.
Yeah.
And then once we made the decision, we like had another all hands meeting, and we were like, okay, these are the big ticket items that we need to make sure are done, like documenting, like finishing documentation in the old system ends on this date, whatever, like who's going to be in charge of that. And we just assigned things to, like our full-time PT that's here all the time, kind of our clinic lead was like, okay, you're going to be in charge of making sure documentation and plans of care are updated and ready to roll. Like, Stephanie and patient access and coordination, like you're going to make sure everybody's schedule gets transitioned over. We kind of distributed all the big jobs up. I did all the nerdy like data and spreadsheets to get to y'all's team for like the EDI enrollment and all of that, because that was my job. We made it so that everybody had a role to play, had a job, understood how important that job was and why it was vital for a successful transition. And then we checked up on it every week. Okay, where are we at on this? Where are we at on that? Do we need to chip in to help call patients to make sure that the schedule's filled in or whatever? So I think doing all that and just having a good team made it so that the transition was not super bad. And I don't know if it had anything to do with the fact that it was moving to Strata, or I have good confidence in my team. I feel like we could have moved to any platform, and as long as we had followed the same process, it would have been good for us.
Yeah. By the way, I agree with you. I never want to disparage other companies or people when they're not in the room to defend themselves. So I won't, say any names or anything like that. But, it's interesting listening to your process. Obviously you made everybody part of it. You included everybody. You got all the inputs, because it wasn't just, hey, it's all about money, or hey, it's all about whatever. That being said, I'm kind of curious for your opinion. And again, I'm not going to name any company names here, right?
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious about your opinion here, because, for example, a lot of companies, they seem to be focused on solely the clinician. So there's this concept of, like, you'll see, and you can tell because the ad, for example, on Facebook or whatever will be like, save time documenting, which sounds noble. Oh my gosh, of course we would want that, right? But often it flies in the face of, some of the, or it comes with some of the risks that come with that, are like, hey, maybe that documentation is not going to be fully defensible. It's not going to be fully complete. It's going to result in a rejection. So again, I don't want to name any names here, but I'm just kind of curious, like, did that ever come up? Like, for example, and I'll just throw ourselves under the bus. We are highly, highly opinionated about how everything has to be done, within our EMR, because we have to go through this like billing aware kind of angle of things. I'm fairly confident, actually, if you talk to our product managers right now and ask this question, I'm fairly confident this is exactly what they would tell you. If your question was, hey, how do I cut the documentation time in half? I'm fairly confident that they would immediately turn around and say, well, if we want to keep the reimbursement rate at 99.9%, that would be the only constraint. So like, they'd be like, well, I don't know if we can commit to like cutting it in half, but we could commit to maybe chopping off 10, 20, 30% in increments, as long as we can make sure the reimbursement rates are high. I guess my question is in this inclusive process you went through, I imagine that, the clinicians they're all good people, I'm sure, but like we're all just human. We're all thinking about ourselves. And so any change is probably, from the clinician standpoint, like going to come with, what's in it for me? Is this going to be harder for me? Am I documenting even more? On your end, as the owner, you're thinking about cash flow. You've got to make sure you hit payroll for everybody. So I'm curious, like, even though you're running the whole thing inclusive, when you were talking about like, hey, here, your list of here's what they do well and here's what they don't, did you happen to include sort of like the financial components of this where it was like, hey, look, I'm not getting enough out of my existing, like, or was it more just like features? Like when you think about what you were talking about with the team?
Yeah, no. So when we had the discussion, I was very upfront about the reasons to move. It made it easy on the clinician side because the platform that we were at before had a big update and it kind of messed up a lot of their
Ah,
templates and stuff. So you mess with like a clinician's templates and they're
yeah.
already ready to jump
Yeah,
ship.
you're in a fight. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but when I had that original conversation with them about like, this is why we're moving, part of it was financial. It's not getting cheaper to run a practice. If we want to keep treating the way that we want to keep treating, which is pretty unique for our area, like one-on-one time and all of that, we need a platform that doesn't make it extra work for us to bill, but that is going to cut down some of the reimbursement time, make sure we're not having to track down as many bills, divert energies from like patient. And one of the main reasons we went with like an all in-house billing, like RCM solution as well, was like, we've got 3 admin team members who were originally hired to like make sure patients were coming in, that they were happy. Like one of them is like a marketing and PR person, like all of that stuff. And they were finding more and more of their time was being utilized for the financial piece, right? Like tracking down authorizations or tracking down bills that got denied or resubmitting files or worrying about recoding. So I was just very honest with the team, like, listen, we're these people, like, we want to be seeing more patients, getting them in, making sure these patients are happy, getting the care they need. And right now we're not, simply because we're diverting our energy to track down all this other admin stuff. So if we can find a solution that allows us to continue to do what we want to do the way we want to do it and frees up these team members to make sure you have a full day of evals or of, whatever, that's what we need to do. So we had that conversation at the very beginning. So it was up front. And whenever we were like having like an after action review from some of these demos, like it wasn't even me. Some of the other team members, because
I
we
see.
were all aligned on what we were doing, would say, so how's this going to work from a billing standpoint? It didn't seem like they were going to, integrate with XYZ, or it seems like it's still going to be the same hoops we're jumping through now. So
Yeah. Yep.
it helped that the other, like, because we were open up front, like all of the team members were looking at kind of all the priorities and they were all bringing it to the table.
I'll just speak for myself. I have this like saying that is probably ridiculous, but I have this saying that like, and maybe I'm just an optimist. I have this saying that like, if you give 2 rational people the same set of facts, you will inevitably come to the same conclusion, which is like, people probably like, why in the world am I saying that? Well, it's because like when you're making big decisions like this, anything that's like going to affect more than 2 people, it's actually easier to just lay out all the facts. Hey, here are the pros, here are the cons, and get everybody to like kind of get to that consensus, and then everything else just becomes easier. It's whether you're doing a decision like you were doing, or you have to make a big strategic decision. To say it another way, if you as the business owner are making most of the controversial decisions, that's like building business on hard mode.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
you get like no extra credit for that. So I think it's kind of cool the way that you did it. By the way, I have to ask how most business owners don't think this way. So did you pick this up, like this consensus driven kind of approach? Did you pick this up at like a previous employer or something like that, or what? Or is this just intuitive to you? You're just like, hey guys,
No,
we got to
I'm
do
just a
this. So let's all
genius.
decide.
No, no, I've been blessed to have a lot of like exposure to different management styles over the years. And so probably one of the earliest ones, and I don't know if I've mentioned him on the show before, but a guy named Derek, who ended up being a business partner of mine in another venture, hired me right out of the VA to do management consulting. And the team was, I think the core team for this project, it was a $5 or $6 million a year project. The core team was 15 to 20 of us, I think. And we were distributed across the US, but like our field offices were here in Georgia. It was government contracting with the State Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. So like every year you're coming up to potential issues, and is the contract going to be renewed? Is it not going to be renewed? What things do we need to do as an organization to continue to add value in a way that maintains the project going and that is delivering results? And there were some big decisions that had to be made every single year, probably every 6 months, about that. Maybe it was a strategic decision about the deliverables. Maybe it was about pricing and daily rates going forward, whatever it was. And Derek was a big proponent of being 100% transparent. You could call him about anything at any time and he'd just tell you exactly where it was about something. So when we had these team meetings, he would like lay it out for us, like, listen, this is where we're at. It's renewal time. The department needs to see X, Y, and Z on this report to make their decision about renewing the contract, which means, there's some of you that might not be here next iteration of this contract, or it means that some of your roles are going to shift in priority to deliver, to work on different projects or different parts of the deliverables, right? But he would kind of lay out everything like this is what the contract demands now. These are what our skill sets are and the team members, like what can we do about it? And then from there it was like an open discussion where the 15 of us would be sitting around a table brainstorming about what needed to happen. In what ways could Rafi step up in this area and kind of drop down in this area? And what ways could somebody else kind of step into this other function of the team exercise, where ultimately in some of those conversations, like decisions were made that we were not super happy with, right? But we at least felt going into it and coming out of it that we had input into the process. We were all clear on the expectations and kind of what was going on. Like no one was in the dark. I feel like that's a huge thing. If people on the team feel like they're missing information or you're withholding information, like people just naturally begin to start thinking like the conspiracies happen because people feel like they don't have all the information, right? So being upfront and 100% transparent really helped those projects over the years. And I think that's just something that really made an impression on me. And I was like, oh, you know what? If I ever lead a team, it just seems to be the best way to do it,
That's probably a good way to also tie it back to the first topic we talked about in terms of like just we were talking about employee parting ways with employees, but on the flip side, it you could tie it back in the sense that like in your LinkedIn post, I think one of the points you were trying to like convey is that if you handle these things right, your team remembers you 20 years later, even if you don't work together for that time period. And this is a good example of like I think his name was Derek. I think he says like we're talking about this guy Derek who
I haven't worked for him in 5 or 6 years,
Yeah. So it's like this guy, by including you in some of these decisions, in the whole team actually in these decisions, the short-term benefit was everybody kind of knew what was happening. And then the long-term benefit is like, here you are doing that with your team years later. And conceivably over the next 5, 10, 20 years, the people that you're having to do this with your team eventually remember you. This is probably a topic for a different episode someday, but in previous episodes with you, we've also talked about like the fact that you encourage your team to get on social media and all these things. And, the counterpoint to that, often business owners will say, well, gosh, if I help them build their brand and then they leave,
they ditch me,
whatever. And I've always thought, like when I think about our team over the last 15, 20 years and in my other businesses that have done this, it's like, I always tell people, it's like, look, I'm playing the long game here. Like I always tell people, I feel like I always have 20 years left in my career. And so I kind of just want to make sure that if people are going to stay with me for a year or two, or a quarter or two, or even a decade or two, whatever time period they think is the right fit to work with me, I just want to leave them better than I found them. There's something about this idea though, of like, okay, I'm going to get judged, so I might as well just say it. So I think the employer-employee relationship is always like kind of a strange one, right? Because if you don't have to go far to like get on the internet, and all the advice you get it basically is all adversarial. The employee reports to the employer. It's just very adversarial. I take the position that like it shouldn't be. As an employer, the way we should be thinking about it is like, we think about compensation and it's got to be good compensation, stuff like that. But part of that compensation should be professional development of some sort, and so like, I just think of it as like, I want to be long-term greedy, and being long-term greedy is hard to define, but I know what short-term greedy is. Short-term greedy is, let me go get that employee for as little as I can pay them. And then as soon as I can stop getting value out of them, we just kind of throw them to the wayside. That's short-term greedy. That's what most employer-employee relationships are. I think what you're talking about kind of aligns a little bit more with like how I think about it too, which is kind of long-term greediness, and not greedy in like the negative context, but rather let's work together for as long as it's good for you, and I'm going to be a fair employer. I want to give you great benefits. I want to do all these as much as I can do. But whether you work with, I always tell people, it's like, if you're going to work with me, whether it's a quarter, a year, or a decade, either way, I want to make sure that like when you leave here, you're better prepared for whatever it is that you want to do. Like whether it's start your own business, move up the ladder, whatever it is. So anyway, I apologize for not being able to use my words well, but I think that particular post caught my eye a couple of weeks ago or whenever it went live, because I was like, Rafi's either going to get like crucified on the social media channels on this or not? And you confirmed it. You always get like
Yeah.
some
A
haters
mixed
on
bag. Yeah, I think like the crux of it is, somebody, and this is probably really easy to understand for clinicians. Like in 10 years, and this was probably the quote that I was mentioning, is David C. Baker wrote a book called The Business of Expertise, and he had written a book years ago that's, I don't even know if it's in print. It's called Managing Right for the First Time, and in that book, he talks about being a manager and leader and what does that mean. And he said, 20 years from now, your clients won't remember your name. They might remember the firm. They might remember, maybe the project. They're not going to remember anything else really about you other than that they've worked with you in the past. The people that you make a real impact on for decades are the people that you led and the people that you worked with and the people that you managed. Healthcare is a small world. So I do feel like this long-term greed, there's a piece of it there. Like if you treat somebody well and you help them get to where they want to get, that might end up being something positive down the line. I've got clients on the consulting side now that I've worked with 5 or 6, 7, 8 years ago. And it wasn't even that they were the client. They just happened to be at the client's organization or they were part of a team. And, like you build this relationship and it ends up, bringing fruit down the line. I think there's even more of that in healthcare where it's a small world. We're all clinicians. People know, like, I don't know some of these people personally, but I know they know about me and I know about them simply because it's a small world, right?
That's right.
So if you treat people well, who knows what happens? Maybe somebody gets starts a health tech startup or something like that. And you were, you got connected because they knew you were interested in XYZ or something. Or maybe there's a business partnership that develops, or maybe there's, something, you might not know. And I'm not saying that that's why you treat people well. It's just, if you are a good human being and make good relationships with people, it's going to come back in a positive way. You're not going to get materially damaged by being a good person.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Strata Stories. Strata PT combines your EMR and billing into one automated system to increase revenue and achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate for physical, occupational, and speech therapy clinics. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and billing services work, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.